And this is also based on kind of a true story. Michael Mann wrote this original script when he was working as a film and TV writer. The true story involves a Chicago detective in the 1960s named Chuck Adamson. Pacino would basically play that character of the film called Vincent Hanna, Lieutenant Vincent Hanna, that detective that's based off Chuck Adamson, who ironically would later collaborate with Mann on Thief, the film that starred James Caan, and then later went on to become a TV screenwriter and producer himself. Now, I'm going to run into a little background on this real-life story, if that's cool with you.
I'd love to hear it.
So in the 1960s, Chuck Adamson was handed a case about an ex-convict from Alcatraz named Neil McCauley, played by De Niro in the film. In 1962, McCauley had been released from prison after a 25-year sentence. Over half of his 48 years of earth were spent in jail. 8 of those years specifically were spent in Alcatraz, with 4 of them being in complete isolation. Adamson began watching him as soon as he released, not at all convinced that McCauley was a reformed man who wouldn't begin his life of crime again. He was right. McCauley began putting a crew together to conduct more heists, with many other crimes recreated in the film that actually happened in real life. The most accurate portion of the film, however, is one without any evidence or bloodshed. Heat has its share of thrilling action moments, but the most powerful part is when Al Pacino and De Niro sit down at that diner together to make film history, one of the best scenes of all time in a crime film. This was actually a reference to what happened to them in real life, and a lot of this dialogue was taken specifically from Chuck Adamson, who put this all together from memory. It wasn't at a diner. He didn't get in a helicopter and chase him down on the LA freeway.
Well, that's Michael Mann style right there, yeah.
But what happened was Adamson bumped into him at a laundromat, and then they went and then they met and they had this conversation that really actually happened. A lot of this dialogue was real between the two of them.
I read that they ran into each other at the laundromat, then they walked over to a nearby deli to get lunch at the deli, and that's where they had their talk.
That's so crazy. And then obviously he caught him at some point. The ending of the real life story is that let me get down to it. In real life, it played out differently than the ending of the film. McCauley and his crew had been researching a heist for weeks that involved robbing the National Tea grocery store in Chicago after an armored car made its money dropped. Little did they know that Detective Adamson and a group of cops were watching them the entire time. McCauley's gang committed the robbery, stealing around $13,000. But on their way out, Adamson and company were waiting, blocking every single exit. A shootout commenced with 2 of McCauley's men killed. McCauley himself tried to run, but Adamson shot him 6 times, leaving the thief dead. So it's actually loosely based on true events, which is wild.
That's amazing. Wow, that's so fascinating. Well, there's just something about this movie and talking about, how in real life it's kind of mundane and a little trivial, and a little boring how they meet at a laundromat. But what makes this movie special is Michael Mann. And Michael Mann is a very special filmmaker. If you aren't familiar with too many of his films, if you haven't seen Thief or Manhunter, which he made before this, you should check them out. They're really remarkable films. Thief was his debut, and it's like an all-time film debut for a director. Thief with James Caan, and then Manhunter with Brian Cox and Grissom from CSI.
It's a Hannibal Lecter movie.
Yeah. William. I can't always remember. I can never remember that guy's name.
Call him Grissom.
Yeah, Grissom from CSI, who's fantastic in it. But that's a really unknown and underrated adaptation of the Hannibal character, and it's just phenomenal. What a great movie. But Michael Mann, he always brings so much style to his films that wasn't really present in American films going out of the 80s and into the 90s, and he created this new trend of how to shoot sequences, how to shoot nighttime. I think that his nighttime photography could be the best of all time, and that's one of the reasons why he switched over to digital filmmaking, digital cameras, most notably with Collateral, and now since Collateral he's always gone digital. The reason for that is because he's shot so many night sequences, and he loves the sky at night, how human eye can see. It can see light in the sky. It can see the blue hue, and sometimes it's a little brighter. But generally, film cameras, if you're exposing for the actor on a set, you're probably gonna not see the sky at all. It's just gonna be blacked out. And so Michael Mann has always been obsessed with trying to depict nighttime sequences as close to the human eye as possible. And that's why in this film, we'll talk about it in a bit, but there's a sequence where he shot it and he basically superimposed over a green screen De Niro and another actor, and then they filmed the night sky separately to overexpose it to get it, and then it just doesn't line up that well.
Doesn't look great.
It doesn't look great. I'm sure it looked fine in '95, but that was him trying to get the night sky visible, because the film cameras couldn't do that if you're exposing for the subject as well as the background. And so in this film, you can see moments of that where he's trying his best to photograph the night, but he's using, the end of dusk or the very early moments of dawn, and it's just such beautiful coloring in the skies. And you could tell when you watch this movie as many times as I have, and you notice how he's shooting, and the timing is everything with the style of his lighting techniques, because they're shooting. This film had 0 scenes shot on sound stages at all. It was all on location, the entirety of the film. That's actually very rare to not shoot anything in a soundstage, because he's a big believer in shooting in real locations, and he understands that timing is everything for the lighting and for the style. And so you have the shot of Macaulay coming home after the opening of the film, and he goes into his Malibu home, and then there's just this beautiful blue light, like just before the sun comes up. There's just like this 5-minute window of this light, and there's another sequence where he and John Voight meet in the parking garage on like the 10th story of the parking garage, and there's a beautiful warm light in the background, like just as the sun's about to set completely. And it's like so close to there being no light. But Michael Mann understands that timing is so important with the style that he's creating. And you can only imagine, like, they probably went through many takes of those sequences, planning it out, and then we're like, okay, we have 5 minutes, let's try and get this shot a couple of times. That's probably how they were doing it on set, and I guarantee you he planned it to the T, like, okay, now's the moment, now we're going to shoot the scene for real. I'm sure they rehearsed it a bunch of times. But speaking about in real life, how when the two men met in real life, it was accidentally at a laundromat, and then they went to a deli. It's kind of boring, but Michael Mann understands that great filmmaking, you need to imbue so much style and so much energy and creativity. And so what's he do for his meetup? Al Pacino hops in a helicopter, tracks down the police detail following Vincent, pulls him over, and then they go, he pulls him over, hey, can I buy you a cup of coffee? And then they meet at the restaurant. It's just so cool. It's just the way he approaches it. I'm sure many other filmmakers would have tried to make it accurate and like, hey, let's run into each other at a laundromat. But Michael Mann knows, like, you know what? I'm going to make this crazy cool, so memorable. I'm just going to do a fucking helicopter. Why not?
Sexy as hell.
Absolutely.
And it's Neil is played by De Niro, and Vincent is Al Pacino. In Heat,